The Secret of the Old Mill. Chapter 15. The Chase. "When?" asked the Hardy boys quickly, in response to their father's announcement of Paul Bloom's escape. "Just a few minutes ago. At least that's when they discovered it. He managed to get out into the jail yard for some exercise, and in some way the guard's attention was distracted. Bloom piled up a couple of old boxes against the wall and was over before anyone saw him. I wonder where he would go. The police are watching the roads and the trains. I didn't think he can get out of the city that way, but I have an idea that he has accomplices here, and if he can, he'll join them, and they'll see that he's smuggled out all right. I was going to suggest that you fellows take the motorboats and keep an eye on the bay." "Good idea," exclaimed Frank, who never needed an excuse to take the boat out. "Come on, Joe. Come on, Chet." "I'll go out in Dad's boat," volunteered Tony. "Fine," agreed the others, and the boys hastened down the street in the direction of the boathouses. Jerry Gilroy and Biff Hooper went with Tony, while Phil went with Chet and the Hardy boys. Frank unlocked the door of the boathouse and went inside, followed by the others. But the familiar shape of the sleuth could not be seen. The front of the boathouse was open. The motorboat had disappeared. "The boat's gone!" he exclaimed in consternation. The other boys stared, amazed at this unexpected development. "It's been stolen!" cried Frank. "No one has a key to the boathouse but Joe and me." "It was here at noon," exclaimed Joe. "I was in here for a few minutes before I went to school." "Who could have taken it?" asked Chet. "Do you think it could have been Paul Bloom?" suggested Joe. The same thought had been in Frank's mind. "That's who it was. He wanted to make a quick getaway, so he figured his best chance would be my boat. And perhaps he found out where the boathouse was, just so he could get even because we turned him over to the police," Joe put in. "He can't be very far away," Phil pointed out. "Your father said he just escaped a little while ago." Frank ran along the landing out in the front of the boathouse. For a moment he scanned the bay. Then he gave a sudden shout. "I see the boat! There's the sleuth! I'd know it anywhere." The others ran to his side, and Frank pointed out a flashing white shape heading far up the bay. There was very few boats out that afternoon, and there was no mistaking the sleuth as it sped eastward. "Get Tony to chase him," exclaimed Joe. "Quick!" They ran hurriedly out of the boathouse and made their way down to the ramshackle building where Tony kept his craft. The other boys looked up in surprise as the Hardys and their companions entered. Tony had been just on the point of starting. "Paul Bloom has stolen our boat," Frank told him. "He's making his getaway in it now." "Paul Bloom?" exclaimed Tony. "Yes, the escaped prisoner." "There's the boat now," declared Joe as he pointed out towards the bay. In a flash, Tony grasped the situation. He leapt into the motorboat. "Jump in. I'll chase him." The Hardy boys scrambled into the boat, but Chet and the others stayed behind. "Too many cooks spoil the broth," explained Chet. "You'll need all the speed you can get out of that boat to catch him. We'd only delay you." Chet was eager to join the chase, but he realized that the fewer passengers Tony's boat carried, the better would be their chance of capturing the fugitive. The other boys quickly took their cue from his attitude and declared that they would remain behind also. "We'll telephone the Barmouth village," suggested Chet. "Perhaps a boat can put out from there and head 'em off." His remarks were drowned in the roar of the engine as Tony's motorboat began to back slowly out into the deep water. It left the boathouse, and then Tony turned the wheel, and the motorboat headed about for the open bay. "Now I guess you wish the sleuth wasn't faster than my boat," he said, with a grin. "We'll have the trouble catching him." He opened the throttle, and the motorboat leapt ahead, leaving a widening trail of foaming water behind. The white shape of the stolen craft could be seen far out in the bay. Paul Bloom was losing no time, and it was evident that his method of escape had not yet been discovered by the police, as Tony's craft was the only boat in pursuit. It was doubtful, too, if the fugitive realized as yet that he was being pursued. "I'll let her out as fast as she'll go," said Tony, suiting the action to the word. The boat was drumming along at a high rate of speed, and it soon became apparent they were gaining on the sleuth. This was evident because Paul Bloom thought his escape had passed unnoticed and did not feel it necessary to run the craft at its highest speed. "If we can only sneak up behind him before he knows we're after him, we'll have a chance," said Joe. "No such luck," Tony remarked. "He'll be looking behind once in a while." Frank found a pair of binoculars on one of the seats, and he raised them to his eyes, adjusting them so that Paul Bloom and the speeding motorboat were brought within its line of vision. The distant sleuth leapt closer as he looked through the glass, and he could plainly see the face of the man at the wheel. They had not been mistaken. The fugitive was Paul Bloom. Even as Frank looked, the man turned, and an expression of alarm crossed his face. He had seen the motorboat pursuing him. Frank saw Bloom lean forward, and the sleuth began to increase its speed. The wing of the water, cleft by its bow, became higher, and the spray was flying. Swiftly the motorboat began to draw away. "He's seen us," said Frank, lowering the binoculars. "We'll keep after him anyway." "We'll chase him clean across the Atlantic if the gas holds out," declared Tony. Joe gave an exclamation of delight. "The gas!" he exclaimed. "The gas! That's where we have him. I went down to the boathouse at noon just to see if there was enough gas in the tank, and it's pretty low. He hasn't enough to take him more than a few miles." "Good!" exclaimed Tony. "That's where we have the edge. My boat may not be as fast as the sleuth, but the gas tank's full, and there's some more in the can. We'll chase him till he has to quit." But if the gas in the sleuth's tank was low, there was no sign of it just then. The motorboat sped on up the bay, gradually widening the distance between itself and the pursuing craft. Tony crouched at the wheel, impassively watching the flashing white streak far ahead. "I wonder where he's headed for," said Frank. "Along the coast, probably," Tony answered. "He'll likely get out on the bay and then head up the coast as far as he can and abandon the boat." "That's probably what he has intended to do," put in Joe. "But he'll never get out of the bay. There isn't enough gas." It was evident that Paul Bloom had no intention of seeking refuge in Barmont Village. On the contrary, he was headed towards the other side of the bay, in the direction of the mouth of Willow River. "Perhaps he intends to go up the river," ventured Frank. Tony shook his head. "Not if he knows what's good for him. He'd run full pump into the falls and rapids near the old mill." "That's right, too." Frank had forgotten those obstacles. But while the sleuth was still some distance away from the mouth of the river, her speed began to slacken. "Good!" exclaimed Joe. "The gas tank's empty." "Let us hope so," returned his brother. "What a sell for that man." But a moment later, the other motorboat began to show signs of life again. "She started up," groaned Joe. "Confound the luck, anyway." A moment later, a splutter came from the other boat. "Gas must be running low," said Frank. "Gee, I wish he would stop entirely." "Same here." Slower and slower went the white motorboat, until at last it was crawling along. Frank picked up the binoculars again, and could see Paul Bloom laboring at the motor, trying to locate the source of trouble. The fugitive cast a glance backward. Frank could see the anxious expression on the man's face. He's trapped, and he knows it. Rapidly they gained on the sleuth, which was now almost at a standstill, drifting back and forth in the waves. Paul Bloom seized an oar that was carried in the boat in case of emergencies, and frantically began to scull toward the shore. But his effort was in vain. Tony's motorboat bore swiftly down upon him. The engine of the sleuth had died. As the other craft drew alongside, Paul Bloom cast aside the oar, an admission of defeat. He sat sullenly in the boat without looking up. "Too bad, Bloom," shouted Frank. "We're going to take you back with us." "I'd have been all right if it hadn't been for the confounded gas running out," gritted the man. "We weren't so particular about getting you as we were about getting back our boat," said Joe. "Will you come back quietly?" Paul Bloom shrugged his shoulders. "I suppose I might as well," he said. "I haven't any weapons. If I had, you may depend on it, I'd put up a fight." "Just as glad you haven't then," remarked Tony cheerfully. Carefully, he brought the boat alongside the sleuth, and Frank and Joe jumped over the side into their own craft. Paul Bloom was resigned. He submitted to having his wrists bound with a piece of stout rope that the boys found on the stern of the boat, and then he sat down philosophically. "I'll get away yet," he told them. "If I can't escape from this jail myself, my friends will see that I get out." "How will we get back?" asked Frank, turning to Tony. Paul Bloom laughed. "That's a problem for you," he said. "The gas tank's empty. What are you going to do about it?" Tony calmly handed over the can of gasoline from his own boat. "This should help," he remarked. "I always keep some spare gas on hand." Paul Bloom, beaten, had no more to say. The Hardy Boys poured the reserve supply of gasoline into the tank, and in a few minutes the engine was pounding away. Then, side by side, the two motorboats turned about and put back for Bayport. Chapter 16. A Plan of Action. The quick work of the Hardy Boys and Tony Prideaux in capturing Paul Bloom won them many compliments within the next few days. Even Chief Khalid grudgingly admitted that it had been a smart capture. In this he was perhaps largely prompted by a feeling that had Paul Bloom made good his escape, he, as chief, would have come in for considerable criticism from the townspeople. As it was, the laxity of the city jail was forgotten in the excitement surrounding the fugitive's return, and Chief Khalid was correspondingly relieved. Had Paul Bloom not been recaptured, the police force would have to bear the brunt of public displeasure and for having allowed the man to slip through their fingers. The connection of the Hardy Boys with the affair caused many people to recall their previous activities in the Tower Mansion case and the affair of the house on the cliff. "Those lads will be smart detectives yet," more than one person was heard to remark. Nothing could have pleased the boys more than recognition and the fact that they showed some ability in the profession of their famous father, and in the light of their recent success, even Mrs. Hardy was beginning to abandon her prejudices against their desire to be some day more than amateur detectives. But although Paul Bloom was safe in jail, counterfeit money was still being circulated in Bayport and Barmouth Village. Hardly a day passed that someone did not report to the police or to the banks that they had been the unwitting victims of counterfeiters by cashing or accepting spurious bills. In one instance, it was a garage owner who had changed a $20 bill for a passing motorist who bought gasoline and oil. In another instance, even the steamship ticket office had accepted a false $5 bill for a ticket, and the mistake had not been discovered until the following day. When the ticket, which was bought at a cost of 80 cents, was traced by its number, it was found that it had never been presented to the steamboat. So many instances came to light that the entire city was on guard against the counterfeiters. But so excellent were the imitation bills, so plausible were the excuses of those who sought to pass them on to many people, they were victimized in spite of their caution. In some cases, merchants were handed counterfeit bills by respectable citizens of Bayport, people who were above reproach, and when the fact was pointed out, The would-be customers explained that they had received the money in good faith from equally reputable citizens. Even the original source of the bad money could not be traced, and the counterfeit bills had passed through so many different hands without being discovered. The boys talked the matter over several times with their father, and one day Fenton Hardy took them into his confidence. "Don't tell anybody," he said, "but the federal agent have come across some evidence which makes them think the counterfeit plant is located somewhere near Barmont Village." "Have they got any definite idea, Dad?" asked Joe eagerly. "They think it's up in the woods, maybe at some farmhouse. You know the country over on the other side of the bay is pretty wild. There would be plenty of hiding places there for counterfeiters." Mr. Hardy spoke of several places that were being watched, and he admitted that so far the federal agents had unearthed little of practical value. "They know that most of the bad money is circulated in this vicinity and in and around Boston," he concluded. "It's just possible the plant may be in the hub." There the talk came to an end, and the boys walked away as they knew their father was getting ready for a hurried trip to the city. "It's a good chance for us to do some real detective work," said Frank to his brother one afternoon after school, as they were in the gymnasium in the barn back of the Hardy home. "The whole city is worked up over this counterfeit money business. Smarter detectives than we are working on the case," Joe pointed out. "They haven't found much yet. Paul Bloom won't talk. If we could get something out of him, we might have a clue to go on." "He won't say a word. It's my opinion he doesn't know much about the source of the counterfeit money anyway. I think it was only an agent sent out to dispose of as much as he could. They probably have a dozen men traveling around the country passing off these bad bills. Once the money gets into circulation, it's liable to pass through a dozen hands before it is discovered. Perhaps that man who stung the garage owner for $20 had no idea the money was bad, and perhaps it's the same way with the fellow who bought the ticket at the steamboat office. It's odd that most of the fuss is being raised right around this city. You don't hear much about it from other places." "It's my idea," said Frank, "that the counterfeiters have their plant right in this vicinity." "Do you think so?" "Just as you said, most of the counterfeit money seems to be passed in and around Bayport. Where do you think they could be making the stuff?" Frank shrugged. "You never can tell. Perhaps in some cellar of one of the downtown buildings for all we know. Personally, I've got an idea. It may be foolish, but I've been turning it over in my head for a few days, and the more I think of it, the more reasonable it seems. Spring it. You remember the day we were at the old mill? I'll say I do. Those fellows wouldn't let me dry my clothes in the mill after I'd fished their precious kid out of the water. But one of them offered us a reward, didn't he?" "Oh, well, you can't take a reward for that." "That isn't what I'm getting at. Do you remember how the other man grabbed the bills out of his hand and turned his back to us?" "Sure, he said he wanted to see if they were fives or ones, but it was rather funny that he turned his back to us. I thought so at the time. Still, he offered the money to us again." "But was it the same money?" Joe was silent. The idea had not occurred to him before. "Do you mean," he said at last, "that perhaps the fellow changed the bills while he had his back turned?" "Exactly. But why should he do that? Don't you see? Maybe the first bills were counterfeit. Perhaps the man thought that we would take the counterfeit bills and later found out that they weren't good. We would remember where they came from and start an investigation. This is only a theory, remember, but perhaps the reason he took the bills from the man they called Doc was to change them for good bills, so that we would have no cause for suspicion." Joe nodded reflectively. "By gosh, Frank, There may be something to your idea after all. Say, perhaps that's where the counterfeiting plant is, right in the old mill. That's just what I've been driving at. There's something fishy about that old mill for all their stories that they're making a patent kind of breakfast food. That may be true, of course, but still. They didn't look very much like scientists to me. To me either. But how can we find out anything more about the place that we know already? They won't let anyone inside the mill, and that's quite evident that they don't want anyone around the place at all. What made me suspicious, said Frank, was the fact that Paul Bloom seemed to be heading for the mouth of Willow River that afternoon he got away in the motorboat. I began to wonder later if he might have been intending to make his way up as far as the old mill. Perhaps he is connected with the gang. It looks reasonable, but if we show our noses around there, they'll just chase us away. There's Lester. Lester? The boy we saved from drowning. We have him on our side anyway, I think. If we haven't, he must be a very ungrateful guy. I'd just like to ask him a few questions about this patent breakfast food. That's a good idea, cried Joe. If he tells us any kind of story at all, we can soon tell if he's lying or not. But anyhow, I don't think he would lie to us. He seemed to me to be a pretty decent sort of boy. That's what I thought of him, too. Chances are, if these men are counterfeiters, they're keeping him there as a prisoner. He might be only too glad to tell us what he knows, if given a chance. And if it turns out that those men really are scientists, and that the mill is really being used for this breakfast food stunt, we won't be making ourselves foolish by poking around and perhaps getting into all sorts of trouble for suspecting they were counterfeiters. Frank nodded. That was my idea in suggesting Lester. We have to work pretty carefully, for it wouldn't do to start a big uproar and find out that those fellows really are scientists after all. But what do you say to taking the motorcycles tomorrow morning and going up to the old mill to see if we can get to talking to the boy? I'm game. Tomorrow's Saturday. Even if the men at the mill do see us, they'll think we're just out on a holiday outing. There's no law against going near the old mill, even if they don't want strangers around. So the arrangement was made, and the Hardy boys laid their plans for a visit to the old mill on the following day. Each felt that there was something suspicious about the place, some mystery that was not entirely nor satisfactorily solved by the breakfast food explanation. If they could only talk to Lester, who was already under obligation to them for having saved his life, they felt that they would go a long way towards verifying or dispelling their suspicions regarding the three men who were the present occupants of the mill.